being a strength coach is so frustrating sometimes is because at a certain level, everything works. Like if somebody goes from doing nothing to something, they're going to have a lot of benefit really quickly because they're protecting themselves from the consequences of doing nothing. I think endurance coaches are usually experts of second order thinking. Like we understand that there are things you might have to do in your training that don't obviously reflect running a 5K or running a road marathon. Like if you're a 5K athlete, like running more than 90 minutes doesn't seem like it would affect it. But the volume and the lower intensity stuff, cardiac stroke volume, you can see how that adaptation that doesn't seem intuitively important, it will actually be really important down the line. Like you said, you just need to move somebody forward. Hopefully they didn't hire you to design a program the way they conceive of it and make a process that they can conceptualize in their head. They hired you to move them forward and solve their problem and get them where they need to go and design a process that works.
In this episode, I exchanged with Coach Keith Mueller, who is based in Boulder, Colorado. Keith helps endurance athletes take a broader view on training and fill some of the gaps that are often overlooked. In this podcast, we talk about strength training for endurance athletes, periodization and what traps you need to absolutely avoid, what training is best to see progress, and how he uses physiological testing and respiratory training in his practice. Thanks to All You Need Nutrition for supporting this podcast. All You Need is a high-quality supplement brand made in France, tailored to athletes who want to cover all their nutritional needs. You can get 10% off your next order by using the code UPSIDE at checkout. And make sure you stay until the end of the video to know more about why I decided to work with them. Now, without any further ado, here's my conversation with Keith Mueller. Keith, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks, Sean. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on. For the listeners that don't know yet, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are and what you do?
Sure. So my name is Keith Mueller. I'm a coach. I kind of call myself a working class coach. I like that term. I don't work for a team. I just work for individuals on an individual basis. And I'm in Boulder, Colorado in the US. And I tend to try to work with the endurance population. I think endurance needs a little bit of help in, I don't know, maybe finding a little more balance in the way that they train and making sure that we're training all the qualities that are relevant and trainable towards helping them in their sport. So most of my work happens in a gym doing strength stuff for endurance athletes.
How did you get into the endurance world? Did you always, were you always in it? Did you practice endurance sports early on?
Yeah, I started running cross country when I was in eighth grade and in middle school, and then had an amazing track coach in high school. And uh, between having a great relationship with that coach and coming across some interesting resources about the endurance community, a gym in Salt Lake City called Jim Jones, the guy who
I remember
the
that.
Mark Twite's writing just like made me fall in love with this idea of like training as a pursuit. So I just had a model for coaching, and my dad was a kindergarten teacher, and just these things rolled towards me wanting to do that. So I, luckily had this compass of like, well, I think I want to be a coach, and kind of move towards that pretty quickly. But yeah, just running in high school and always trying to do longer efforts on 2 feet or two wheels and getting out there.
How did you start in the coaching realm? How did you get to it? You said you were always interested in it, but what were your first steps in that world?
Yeah, I think when I was in school, just getting a kinesiology degree, I was, paying attention to coaches and just thinking about what my philosophy around training would be, just doing things on my own. And when I got out of school, I was able to go right back home where I was from, wasn't sure what I was going to do, and ended up on my old track coach's his cross country staff. He coached a big Division I girls program for cross country in the fall, so I got on his staff, and it was a pretty cool big competitive program that was vying for state championships and things like that. So I was able to start coaching right away in that sense, and then found my way into working at a gym that I had a membership at called Dayton Strength and Conditioning in Dayton, Ohio, and then yeah, it was CrossFit adjacent, not an affiliate, but kind of operated in the same model. So I taught group classes and worked with personal training clients, but worked with an endurance athlete whenever I could get my hands on them. So runners whenever I could. And then for about 4 years ago, my wife and I came out here to Boulder, Colorado, where there's quite literally an infinite amount of endurance folks that are interested in pursuing the best performance they can, whether they're elite or just weekend warriors.
What would you say has changed the most in your approach to training since you started coaching versus now?
Change the most? That, I don't know. That's a tough question. I think like maybe nothing about the training, but just getting better at I'm surely plenty things about the training. But I just can't point toward anything. I would say just being a better coach in the sense of like stopping treating people like puzzles and getting better at like connecting with people on a human level. I think I got attracted to the profession from that puzzle aspect of things, of just being interested in all that stuff. But just getting better with connecting with people, the people that I work with, and developing uh developing trust with people.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting and important point because I mean we both love, the science, the data and understanding what's going on inside the body, but at the end of the day, coaching, and that's something that I was confronted to early on. Somebody who was influential in the first year of my coaching career, who said, Sean, you're not in the fitness industry. You're not in the fitness business. You're in the people business, and you
Mm-hmm.
need to understand that coaching is about people first. And sure, you need to be competent on the training side and being able to do your job, but if you want to be successful as a coach, you need to know how to connect with people, talk to people, coach people. Is that something that you are already sensitive to early on?
Well, no, probably not. Like I think, I could have nodded my head along to what you're saying when I was 22, when I was just starting coaching people, but you have to have experience. I had to, have my marriage and have, more and more personal relationships and mess up with athletes that was responsible for along the way. You had to have moments where you didn't support them in the way that they needed, or you had your eye off the ball or something like that, and just be aware enough to learn from those things and try not to make those mistakes again. So it's just a experience thing. I think I was ready to um I don't know. I was ready to try to like execute a plan with people when I was young, but then you need to walk through that process with people, obviously, day by day, especially if you want to coach someone for a long time. If you want to progress them on a long timeline, year over year, it becomes so much more complicated than the planning.
Is there a particular moment or an event that stands out to you where that become apparent to you or where things shifted a bit for you?
Yeah, well, I think anyone that does it for a living, and especially if you do it as like a sole proprietor the way I do, where I'm not part of an organization or have anybody under me, like each of those relationships is important, both from a perspective of like, well, I just want the work. Like I want the work and I want to be engaged in this process. But I also, it's how I make my living. So anytime you have somebody that's like, oh, something's not working, I need to take a break. If you're in the business mindset and the wanting to be involved mindset, then you end up maybe giving them resistance on that or trying to work your way around it. Whereas if you care about the person, then you understand that they're telling you the truth for a reason, and they probably don't take what they're telling you lightly,
Mm.
right?
Hmm.
So, when there's someone that I really wanted to work for and they needed to take a break and do their own thing for a little bit, then maybe they would make their way back to me. I've had opportunities where I dropped the ball in terms of like receiving that information.
Yeah, it's interesting because there is that tension, right, on the business side where you have to get do the work, and obviously it's not quote unquote good for business for people to stop working with you. But at the same time, we also need to strive towards independence for the people that we work with. I think that's an important part of coaching. There's a quote that comes up to mind. I think her name is Carmen Bott. She's a strength and conditioning coach up in Canada. And she said that many years ago, and it stuck in my mind. She said, you need to coach your clients so that they can train by themselves, but you need to treat them so that they never want to leave. But then obviously sometimes they have to. It's not that they don't want to. It's that life happens and they have to do this. But it's still there's always that relationship between the two, right?
Yeah, yeah, I certainly agree with that. Yeah.
So, talking about endurance training and what you do in that realm, you said you like to help endurance athletes. Today, your current perspective of, let's say, the endurance field in general, with whether it's cycling, running, or else, what are the biggest holes in, let's say, the average training plan for an endurance athlete that you try and fill with your skills?
Yeah, I think like answering your first question, it's just broad context. I haven't been around in the field for long enough to know how it might have gotten to be this way, but endurance training seems so siloed from other sports, whether it's like this tradition or the way that the sport is being investigated scientifically. It just seems like its own thing where it's got these buckets. And I know like probably through your experience with CrossFitters deconstructing those boundaries between endurance and conditioning so-called strength training, that like those buckets don't actually exist, and it's all really just these different sides of the same coin and these different forms of effort. So like broadly, I think there's just some context missing in the endurance space that stops the coaches who are responsible for preparing these athletes from seeing all the avenues that they might be able to go down to prepare them. And there's certainly, obviously the best in the world are doing the job well to get prepared, but especially if you filter down to the people that are just, there's a billion runners in the world, maybe, ballpark figure. There's plenty of people that make that their thing and
Mm.
triathletes. And it's just like, I don't want to make it all about strength training, but that's the obvious example of like where people, the context in which they're looking at the sport doesn't let them see strength training as anything other than like a prehab sort of measure, rather than something that might really help them prepare for a lot of the specific demands that they actually face. It's like a second order thinking type of
Mm.
thing, like where I think endurance coaches are usually experts of second order thinking. Like we understand that there are things you might have to do in your training that don't obviously reflect running a 5K or running a road marathon. Like if you're a 5K athlete, like running more than 90 minutes doesn't seem like it would affect it. But the volume and the lower intensity stuff, cardiac stroke volume, you can see how that adaptation that doesn't seem intuitively important, it will actually be really important down the line, right? But that second order thinking doesn't get applied to the gym or to training the respiratory system or to nutrition or whatever it might be. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
it makes a lot of sense, and it's it's something that I've been thinking about a bit recently, and especially in the context of CrossFit. Like you said, I work a lot with CrossFitters, and it seems to me, and I'd love to hear your take on that. It seems to me like at somewhere along the way we've misunderstood the term specificity, or at least we're
Mm-hmm.
misinterpreting that principle that is so central to physical preparation in general, right? I think a lot of people today think specificity and they think my training needs to look like my competition. And that's what's going to bring the transfer around. This is how I'm going to get better. And if I do things that don't look like my sport or like my competition, I'm wasting my time because it's not specific. When in reality, specificity, the principle of specificity is not that, right?
Sure. Yeah. It's like, well, how are you even recognizing specificity? And the terms you just used was like looks like, right? And we see that in the gym all the time, that the way people want to do strength for running is to mimic running, make it look like the positions of running when you're looking at somebody's whole body. And there's this obvious correlate to that. Um, I think when people get into the gym, whether it's for running or for anything, trying to prepare for anything, their first step is sort of doing whatever they've seen other people do or heard other people do. You just mimic. Maybe you're in junior high, right? And you're doing bench press because that's what everyone's doing. I know that was me in seventh grade, right?
Mm.
And the next step is realizing, oh, like all these different exercises that we do, there are categories that we can put them in. Where this a deadlift looks like a kettlebell swing, looks like a broad jump,
Mhm.
right? So there's these hinges and there's pushes and pulls and squats. And you start putting these things in the categories, and then you name them movement patterns, right? And I think a lot of people are in that stage, and they start looking for the patterns that reflect their sport to the extent that they understand it. I think there's a third category that you can graduate from movement patterns. And I think I got a lot better at my job when I started seeing like tissue specific rather than shape and position specific.
Mm.
So, like, what is the tissue going to experience in our sport, whether it's a magnitude of force, a rate of that loading, a level of strain, a speed, you know what I mean? And try to prepare it for that, which might mean exposure to more of that it's going to experience, or exposure to the opposite. If we think about like hips, a joint like a hip that has a ton of degrees of freedom and needs a ton of degrees of freedom to be healthy, if it doesn't experience that in running or cycling, then giving that hip exposure to those degrees of freedom on a regular basis is like critical for the long-term health of that. So we can be talking about checking the box that's going to be specific to the sport, or checking the box that the sport and the person's life doesn't check on its own. And that feels like specificity to me.
Yeah, there's that. And then obviously we run into the issue of time, and
Mm-hmm.
you have to balance the limited amount of time that people have to train. You have to decide where you're going to allocate those minutes. And at least in the sports that I'm more familiar with, the CrossFit, sometimes even MMA, combat sports, which are both sports which are technically very demanding, and you need many different skills. You need to be good at many different things. The weightlifting, the gymnastics, there's obviously a lot of specific considerations within the CrossFit world, and even more the combat world. And it's almost easy to then say, well, I just don't have time to do anything else. I'm just going to do that. And
Mm-hmm.
obviously it works up to a point, right? You can start something and just do the thing and become better at the thing. But it seems like there's that transition then, and that's probably the hardest part, is figuring out, okay, when is it time to switch gears? Because right now I'm revving way into the red in first gear. I need to go to second, but people think, oh no, I just need to press on the gas more to keep improving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like CrossFit is really interesting in the sense that like almost none of it is trickle down. Like you need touches on these things because you might be tested in them directly. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? It's not like there's like not you it'd be really hard to name a movement that's like purely supportive. Maybe you're like a bottoms up kettlebell press or something. They're not going
Right.
to do that in the sport, or whatever, like, these prehab movements, so to speak. But like a back squat will show up, a snatch will show up, an overhead squat will show up. You need touches on them because you're actually going to do them on competition day. They're training, but they're also the thing. It's so hard to balance all that stuff. Whereas in running or triathlon, like there are these very specific things, and you're trying to get everything to trickle down to that. So it looks supportive. And I think that like, the running coach who eschews strength training and doesn't see a benefit to it, like they're smart. You know what I mean? They understand that like, why would I do a maximal lift if they know that they're not going to express that on the day? Like that's a smart way to think about it. But I think it's a definition problem. Like it's the
Mm.
way that they're contextualizing strength. And when I talk about endurance missing context, it's like we also in the endurance world don't speak the same language as the rest of the training world at all, right? Like when we say strength, they're probably talking. It's really easy for people to talk about like that in terms of like force output, which would be correct. I think, you can talk about it in terms of like how much force can you generate, how many pounds can you lift. And in that sense, you'd be like, well, I'm never going to have a maximal slow contraction like that in road running of any distance. But if we take strength to be more of a neuromuscular quality than like an output thing, where you're saying like, well, what's my set point for like my nervous system's ability to recruit motor units? And we know that the nature of a road running event is that recruitment is going to fatigue over time. Then the set point for that ability to recruit and the point from which you start to degrade across your race starts to look really important to me.
Mhm.
But I can only say that and see that because I've decided how I'm going to define strength, right? It depends on what keyhole you're looking at the topic through.
And talk about definitions. I remember going to, I was lucky enough to do a training camp with Sam Laidlow and Richard, his dad,
Mm-hmm.
French triathlete. And they were talking about leg strength very much in the way of durability, right? Do you have the leg strength to just keep running after you get off the bike? So that was almost like oh, okay, so that means this. And like you said, it's different worlds almost, and they don't use the same vocabulary. And then when you're trying to talk between disciplines, it's almost like you're talking past each other because we didn't, like you said, we didn't agree on definitions, which
Yeah.
that's something I got early on, especially from Pat Davidson. Uh, Defining terms and understanding what you're trying to talk about is kind of the first step to anything, because otherwise, like we just said here, you're not going to go very far if you're trying to argue something, but you don't mean the same thing.
Yeah. And I think critically, like you don't have to be right in your definition. You know what I mean? You can change. You can decide what these things mean to
Mm,
you. You can accept like an academic definition, but you just have to have something that you're working with. So, like Sam and his dad, they weren't wrong. That's another way to classify strength because there's an incoming forces issue that you need to prepare for as
mm,
well. But it's just like, what are the different ways that we're going to use these terms? And I would argue that we could have different terms for each of these different qualities and not put them all in the same bucket as strength, right?
mm, mm,
It needs to be diversified so we can understand what we're talking about. So what I'm interested in is having conversations with myself and conversations with other people about what are the demands at a really high level that endurance sports even face. And even previous to that, like right under my desk here, I've got a bunch of books that I really like. There's a like Jason Koop's Training Essentials for Ultra Running, Training for the Uphill Athlete, and Inigo Mujica's book, Endurance Training Science and Practice. I think all these books are awesome, but I've got a bone to pick with them because all of them take um, the definition of endurance like for granted. They don't even talk about it. Like chapter one is like, what are the adaptations to endurance training? What does this sport even look like? But nobody starts from this first principle of like, what is endurance? Like what is the quality of that and why might we want to improve it? And then that can lead us to what training for that looks like. And not to be self-promotional, but like my project is called Higher Ground Athletics because that's really my ethos as a coach is um, getting as high up enough of a vantage point as possible to try to see as much of this landscape as possible so we can avoid these weird dead ends and like miscommunications. So like I think that thought experiment is really interesting of like, well, what even is endurance? Like, do you have an opinion on that, Sean? Like, what's your working definition of that?
I remember I was talking with a friend recently, and that question came up, and I don't have the exact one in my head right now, but I think it was something along the lines of sustaining a rate of effort. And obviously, it really depends on the event that you're talking about, because endurance
Mm-hmm.
for a 400-meter runner is different than for a marathon runner. But it has to do with the sustainability of a certain regime of contraction or a certain type of effort or a certain output, whether you're trying to extend it to longer, whether you're trying to uh, decrease the rate of slowing down or losing a certain ability. If we talk about durability, for example, you could talk about, and we could think about endurance also as going harder on a certain time domain. That is,
Yeah.
for me, it's also endurance, right? If you're trying to go from 340 watts over 5 minutes to 400, that's you've improved your endurance. If sure, there's power considerations in there, but I think all of those concepts kind of fall under the big kind of umbrella of endurance. I
Perfect. Yeah. So I think our definition for the term and all the little ways that we could use it needs to be really broad so that it can work in all those different scenarios. Otherwise, you end up getting lost, right?
mm,
So I think where I've landed is that endurance is simply the temporal domain of effort,
mm,
right? It is
mm,
applying time to exertion, right? So as long as what you're doing, as long as your effort is longer than a moment, a couple of seconds, then endurance is going to be one of the demands of your sport. And I would apply this to strength sports, Olympic lifting and powerlifting, where you have three attempts that might be really close together,
mm.
only 1 or 2 minutes, right? If you have to follow yourself in Olympic weightlifting, I think it's 2 minutes. Like the ability to repeat something over and over again falls under that of like how does time play into into the demands of our sport. So if we take that, if you can accept my definition for the moment of like it being the temporal domain of effort, then endurance adaptations would be anything supportive of sustaining or repeating effort across time. And that time, that x-axis goes to infinity, right? Whatever we might want to do, whether we're talking about the difference between the 200 and the 100-meter dash is what? It's longer, right? Difference between the 200 and the 400, it's longer, right? And that goes forever.
And I think I really like your definition. I'm definitely gonna steal it.
You can have it.
I'll
Yeah.
give you credit, but I think and I like it because it's simple. And like you said,
You're speaking my language.
it applies broadly, right? Which again, the term endurance is a broad term. It is almost by definition non-specific because it can be applied to so many different situations, context. You used the word context before, and that's something I hammer with the coaches that I work with when we talk about when they ask questions. Oh, what type of interval, what modality, what type of this and that. It's always about the context that you find yourself in. So I really like that definition of just thinking about the temporal aspect of effort, and then anything that falls within that, you're talking about endurance. There are going to be different kinds of endurance. There's different ways to work on that quality, depending on your context. But the definition works, which I think is
Yeah,
awesome.
I think if you get any more specific, then you cut yourself off. You've made some assumptions that won't apply in the context you might find yourself in, or yeah, like to imply something is to assume it, and you can get burned for that.
Mm.
So if like carrying this forward, if endurance is the temporal domain of effort, and we want to think about adaptations that support sustaining or repeating efforts across time, then like what are the demands of sustaining? Like what starts to pile up and what do you need to meet? Like, so in my mind, that's where we would start to, other people might instantly jump to the word aerobic. You know what I mean? Or the word, yeah, all these different things, and get too physiological too quickly. But like, I think it's really beneficial to like remain qualitative and be like a little bit more of a philosopher in this type of stuff rather than a technician or an engineer or any of those things. So like in sustaining effort across time, at least in humans, I suppose, like that's going to mean maybe we got to back up. Like, let's say if you're going a given rate and you want to go for longer or you want to go faster than you are right now, that's going to imply a few things. Like the first would be more cellular energy turnover than what you're experiencing right now. If you and I both start walking, more cellular energy turnover than we're experiencing sitting in our chairs. If we start jogging, more cellular energy turnover. Like we have to create the energy to convert to mechanical work, right? So that's the first thing we have to think about is being able to support that. That leads you to metabolism, right? Which is obviously what most of the endurance world is obsessed with, is creating those adaptations that support metabolism. But what we don't think about as much is there's going to be, well, and coming along with that metabolism, there'd be like heat that you have to dissipate. So that's a demand, right? You have to deal with the products of your output mechanically. And then another product of that output is like the way that we engage in sports is that we exert forces into the external environment, like whether that's a competitor or the ground or pedals or a barbell. Like that's what we do. That's what our musculoskeletal system seems to have evolved to do, is to take that chemical energy, turn it into mechanical work, and make sure that mechanical work makes it to the world to actually make something happen, move something else, excuse me. So along with exerting those forces on the external environment, because of Newton's third law of motion, there's going to be forces that are directed immediately right back onto you in an equal and opposite fashion. So being able to withstand those is what I'm driving at, right? So cellular energy turnover, dealing with the heat that's the result of that cellular energy turnover, and dealing with the incoming forces that are a product of exerting external forces to do whatever your sport specific task is. In my mind, that's like a quick back of the napkin idea of like, what are the demands we need to prepare for? And then you subdivide those from there.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really, again, the endurance definition that you offered, I think is really really interesting, and it fits. At least in the few minutes I've had to think about it, but I really like it. Where I definitely want to come back to those ideas, the metabolic side, the heat side, and then the incoming forces. I want to continue first on what's missing in endurance training. We talked about strength training. What other silos? Because like you said, it's a continuum, and I guess we, again, I'm gonna take from Pat Davidson. It's not him, it's George Box, but all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I
Mm-hmm.
think siloing things is a useful model. It's wrong, but it's a useful way to think. But then obviously, if you get locked into your silo, then that becomes a problem. If you can't, like you said before, zoom back out of it and see the big picture for what it is. Um, so, what other silos are underappreciated in endurance training as a whole, in your opinion?
I think, yeah, breaking, yeah, within each of those things, like strength training is what I feel most prepared to talk about, like breaking
Mm,
apart into like these different categories. And it's not like you need to make things super complicated, but you do have to understand that like in in going from doing no strength training to doing something, the reason that being a strength coach is so frustrating sometimes is because at a certain level everything works. You know, like if somebody goes from doing nothing to something, they're going to have a lot of benefit really quickly because they're protecting themselves from the consequences of doing nothing.
mm,
And that's what most endurance athletes are facing. Most runners that are having silly tendonitis issues or just stress fractures, stuff like that. It's like, man, a lot of this stuff is resolvable. Like IT band issues, a lot of these exercises or these injuries, so to speak, are silly in the sense that, like, if you just thought ahead a little bit, like, you could avoid that, and if you had a little more balanced exposure to certain things, you could avoid them most of the time.
mm,
Um, so if you do something, everything will work, but eventually you got to start thinking about like what different types of inputs lead to different building different qualities. Like how do we bias things towards uh, the neuromuscular aspect of strength, the red stuff contractile muscle tissue aspect of strength, or like the white stuff connective tissue force transmission aspect of things, and whether it's loading schemes, rep ranges, things like that, contraction types,
mm.
right? That'll lead us to different stuff. So it doesn't have to be super complicated, but just knowing that there are a few different paths that you can go down is like, even in the people that lead the field in training with really, really high level endurance athletes, I don't think they think that way because I think they're looking at, again, the gross movement pattern and the shape that the body is in.
Mhm.
Uh, they're not subdividing enough. So, I was talking about zooming out earlier, and now I think I'm making an argument for zooming in a little bit more in other ways.
I want to bounce
Does that
back
answer
on
your question?
it. It does. I do want to bounce back on something you went through when you talked about tendonitis issues, uh, and I think we come back, at least in my mind, we come back to the idea of context, and that's always something. That's always a question that comes up: is how many sessions should I do? How long should the sessions be? And we we completely think about this in a completely abstract way instead of contextualizing on, oh, how much have you run the last 3 months? Zero. So how about you don't start running 5 hours a week? Because
Mm-hmm.
obviously the system is not going to be able to talk. It's going to work great for a week. And then week two, your shins are going to start to hurt. And then week three, you have to stop and start back to zero. So it just highlights how important the context is, and we can repeat it, people still don't think about, okay, what am I doing now? And I think that might be probably the easiest thing to do to decide what to do next is determine what you did in the last three weeks or month, because that's your starting point essentially. And
Sure.
this is where you should start thinking about your training, nothing else, not a plan you saw online, not whatever world record holder is doing right now. And oh, I like this session, I should do that. But
Yeah.
go back to, okay, where are you now? Who are you? What are you built for to begin with? What have you done in the past? What have you done in the near past? And then kind of build from there, right?
Yeah. Say what you will about like Training Peaks. That software has, like, for the listener, Training Peaks like creates the stress score for
Mm.
different efforts, and it helps you quantitatively compare the 3 hour long effort with the 70 minutes of higher effort. It'll give them a score that you can compare the stress of the two. And say what you will about that, but I love philosophically their fitness fatigue form kind of calculation that they have, where your fitness is a 6 week rolling average of your daily TSS, your daily stress score. So that idea, I think, is really profound. This idea that like your fitness right now is a 6 week average of what you've experienced in the past 6 weeks. Like that, at both that from a quantitative level, but also probably like what types of things you've been doing. You
Hmm.
cannot escape that. If you have not been chronically doing something in the past 6 weeks or 8 weeks, whatever you want to call it, you're not prepared for it. Like if you add it in, it's going to be maybe not like the danger zone, but you got to be really careful about frequency, volume, intensity if it's new, right? And then they have their the fatigue would be the 7 day rolling average, so a much more acute look at your acute workload rather than your chronic workload. And then form would be fatigue, your fitness minus fatigue, right? So if you drop your acute workload, then your form will shoot through the roof because you've got fitness banked up, but you don't have any fatigue built up. And that's going to look like a peaking strategy, right? That's going to have you being ready to rock on race day because you've got the fitness, but you've removed the fatigue. So, like, just from a conceptual standpoint, I think that's really like profound and speaks towards that. You have to know where you are right now, which is always going to be just like a rolling average, so to speak, of what you've been exposed to recently. I think this idea of exposure is so much more important than training. You know what I mean? Where we like make things like these really scientific inputs where it's like we did this and we trust that the body received this exact same symbol. It's so much messier than that. I love this drawing in an Alan Watts book. Are you familiar with this guy who was like
Very
a
much so.
Zen communicator? He just had a squiggle on the page, right? And he said, "This is reality," and that we lay a grid. I think he called it a net over reality.
Mm.
Drew a grid on top of it and said, "You know, we think that the grid, we think that that net is the world, but it's covering it up and helping us make sense of it. It's language, it's concepts, it's scientific reasoning, it's all these things. And we need it because it helps you and I have the conversation that we're having right now, but we can't mistake that for being the actual world." So in my mind, like productive training communicates with the wiggle, the actual base reality of what's going on, and how well we understand it is not actually that important whether it's productive or not. And I think it's heterodox, but that's led me away from periodizing, like at least in the work that I do with endurance athletes. Like there's not a very strong plan of where we're headed except more over time. And yeah, I guess there's not really a calendar laid out. It's just like, well, it's pretty simple to know what we're doing right now, and it's pretty simple that we can just do that heavier or faster or more, and we can pick a route to go down based on our conversations as
Hmm.
we go. But any of that stuff, I think, is just laying a lot of layers of abstraction and assumptions on the training that could work because your plan could be amazing, or it could really struggle to survive the implementation of it.
Yeah, and the plan. While you were talking about the squiggle, I thought of the map is not the territory, right?
Oh, exactly. Yeah,
It's a
yeah.
representation of, but it will never come to the level of detail and reality of what the territory actually looks like when you have your foot on the ground.
Yeah,
Uh,
there's a reason all those sayings are, make it into parlance so it can be said much faster than what I just said,
no, but
rambling.
I liked your way of putting it. Back to what you were saying now, I fully agree with you. I think long-term planning is having an idea of the direction in which you're going, and
Mhm.
it is like walking a very long distance in the way that what's right in front of you is pretty clear. And then what's a little bit farther back, you can see it, but it's less clear. But look on the horizon, you don't know what's there. You know it's
Mhm.
there, but you don't know what is actually right there, maybe 20 kilometers, 50 kilometers away from your eye. And so for me, planning is having that, knowing what direction you're going in, knowing where on the horizon you're trying to go, because you need direction. But the farther away from right now you look at, the less clear it is. So it kind of blurs out as you move forward in time. And then obviously as you get closer and closer, that becomes clearer and clearer, just like the plan would, right? And
Yeah.
I think also not being attached to plan A emotionally is super important. And I think it is interesting, even if it's conceptual, to have a plan A, and it doesn't have to be detailed to the nth degree. In 8 weeks, I'm doing those reps and those sets, but just kind of having, oh, it's almost like a thought experiment that shows you if you're going in the right direction. But then you iterate as you move along, and like you said, it's going to be how the athlete reacts. Oh, what happened there? They got sick for a week. Well, that threw off your whole thing. If you had planned it all to the T for the next 6 months, or
Totally.
they had a breakup, they had a bad breakup, and they have to deal with that. And we know how much stress, even though it's emotional, it's psychological, but the body doesn't care, right? It's stress is
Mhm.
stress, and so that's going to throw the plan off. So you have to be in the day to day reality to really make it all work, and it's kind of having that tension between the two, right? Having that, you know what the direction, you have no clue what's actually all the way over there. You have some idea, and probably the more experience you have, the clearer the idea is. But you still need to, okay, just focus on what's in front of us and just keep iterating, moving forward.
Tension is the right term because any coach knows that if we just have unlimited time, we're golden. You know, if we can just, keep moving a little bit forward, we're going to, and a lot of people operate that way. A lot of Gen Pop athletes are just, yeah, they're going to move forward. They're going to race along the way. And we just want to feel like we're making progress. But then a lot of people that maybe make their living competing, there's deadlines to their fitness. So the tension comes from that of like, well, we want to smooth this out and use all of our time and not rush our process to get anything sooner than we can have it. But we also have to get somewhere. We've got some goals, to get to a certain place by a certain time. And the way people bridge that gap is with progressive overload. Like I think any coach, that's the first principle you learn. Is like you have to do more over time. And I think progressive overload is another thing that's misunderstood in the training community in general, but then also especially endurance coaches. I think that endurance coaches love to plan. You know what I mean? Like the whole, especially if you do it remotely, like you're doing it
Mm,
via the spreadsheet, you're doing it via training peaks. Your view of the athlete is the calendar because you're not there with them. You're not working with bodies, right? So you get stuck in this planning and progressive overload. I call it putting your progressive overload cart in front of your adaptation horse, right?
mm,
Where you are using the more over time, the more volume, more intensity, more frequency, using those metrics, those variables to drag fitness along. Whereas I think productive training often needs to be the opposite, where you need to advance those stress markers, those inputs, and then settle in and wait till there's a sign in the training that you need to take a step forward with some of those components that make things more stressful and do more, quote unquote, more. And I think that's for a lot of people the way to make sustainable progress without, if you do it by the calendar and if you say we're going to add 5 pounds a week, then you are for sure going to outpace your body's ability to adapt. Like your calendar is going to move faster than the person's physiology eventually, for sure, because of the guarantee of the life stress, the breakup, the bad night of sleep, the undereating, whatever it is. The human
mm.
is going to not be able to sustain that. But if you wait for someone to catch up, and then take the next right step, then you can maybe avoid a lot of those issues that end up costing you more time than you saved by having the perfect calendar. But the tension of needing to be in a certain place by a certain time makes it really hard to be patient with that process.
There's the patient part, which, like you said, I think is a big problem in today's world, especially where everything is about instant gratification. And I'll come back to the CrossFit world because that's just so true there, where people want to just test them because any CrossFit workout, any Metcon is a test in and of itself. People just constantly want to test themselves to make sure that they're still fit. And they want to do this multiple days a week, every single week, every single year. Whereas, and again, for beginners, that works fantastic, right? High intensity is a great stimulus. If you're a beginner and you don't do stupid things, you're going to progress pretty fast because it's new and your body's not used to it, and you get a good response. But again, you got to get to the point where you have to shift the way you do things, and that shift, I see it as a time scale shift where you can't just expect to beat your previous best on that Metcon in the next 2 weeks. Now it's going to take 2 months, or maybe it's going to take 6 months until you see the next kind of wave of progress. And there's two sides. There's obviously the athlete or the person practicing the sport, and then there's the coach as well. And I think us as coaches sometimes have a hard time being patient as well, and giving stuff that they've already done, or repeating things, or maintaining something rather than always trying to push and complexify and modify, because it almost feels uneasy to just give the same plan a second week in a row and just do it again. You don't need to do anything different. Let's just run it through again. But it almost feels like we have to do something different, better, more complex in order for it to work, when really it's rarely necessary.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's the thing about that from a training perspective of, okay, something must be different in order to convince the body to devote more resources to adapting to this or whatever it might be. But again, that's the grid, right?
Hmm.
Because that's you understanding something about it versus it's still got the same signal probably if it's 7 to 10 days later and you repeat the same session essentially. It's also not the same session even though you do the same things because it's
Hmm.
a different context of what you did the day before, the day after, things like that. Oh, I had something else on my mind, but yeah, there's yeah. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought.
No,
The Go ahead.
but I like what you said, the idea of essentially letting the body do its thing and only adding when you need to add, and not because you said you were going to or you think you need to. It's again going back to what is going on, what's the context, and again that context changes day to day. Obviously, minute by minute, it evolves, and so you always have to come back to the now and what is the context now, and that will inform your next step forward. And that's probably one thing that I've changed the most over the years, is just being so much more flexible with what we are going to do next or what we might not do tomorrow. Almost all of it is based on the athlete or the person that's in front of you and how they're feeling today and what they did yesterday and what happened this morning. And before, I was like, no, we wrote the plan. We have to stick to the plan. This is important.
Mhm.
But no, what's important is to make sure that we go, again, zooming out. You got to get the work done in a sustainable way, or if it's unsustainable, it's for a short period of time, and that's planned so that on the back end you can overcompensate and all that kind of stuff. But otherwise, it has to be sustainable because the goal is to train in perpetuity. That is
Yeah,
essentially what is going to make you better. There is no hero workout. There's no champions session that is going to, double your fitness overnight. It's actually just doing the thing over and over again. And then obviously you have to orient that towards the event, towards your needs, towards what time of season it is. But really, Steven Seiler published a study recently on HIIT training, and the conclusion was essentially this: there is no magic format for a high intensity interval training session. It's just about the consistency of doing the work over time that will bring you results. And it almost seems too simple, but it is really that simple.
Mhm. Yeah, that brought a lot of stuff to mind. Like I think what you were saying a moment ago, that probably has to be my answer to your question at the beginning of our conversation about changing things is just being comfortable not doing anything, like not changing anything. And like, can you imagine if all of the signaling value of a given training session just went it get like the all the water got squeezed out of that sponge the moment you did it? Like, oh, you did back squat 5 sets of 5, that's it. Like, oh, we can't do back squat 5 sets of 5 at the same weight for 6 months because your body will remember and you'll get zero training effect from it. Like, that's a silly way to think, right? Of course, there's diminishing returns and accommodation, which I think is a really important concept in training. But yeah, like just being comfortable not changing very little and letting and spreading things out over more weeks rather than less, and not looking for things to like justify my existence as a coach has been something that I've gotten more and more comfortable with. Because ultimately, like you said, you just need to move somebody forward. They didn't hire you to, hopefully they didn't hire you to design a program the way they conceive of it and make a process that they can conceptualize in their head. They hired you to move them forward and solve their problem and get them where they need to go and design a process that works, whatever that looks like. And for a lot of people, what works is doing less, doing it more specifically in a way that actually communicates with what's going to make the change. You know what I mean? Like communicates with the piece of their physiology that they need. Um, and sometimes you need to change less, but then other times I think coaches need to understand that the opposite is true, where the doors you walk through in training sometimes do kind of close behind you, where you've done a lot of this type of stuff because that's the way you understood it or the way your coach understood it. And now that type of stuff doesn't carry very much signaling value for you anymore. And you have to find a different way to stimulate the adaptation you're looking for. And that's why I think like the physiological testing, like with Moxy and gas exchange and things like that, is so useful. Like I'm shocked here even in Boulder, this like endurance mecca, it's just pure VO2 max lactate, VO2 max lactate, like these really quantitative descriptive tests that tell you something about yourself, but don't really help you ask or answer any other questions besides that. But I love these limiter assessments, this thinking of like, well, what's probably the central thing that forces your sustainable, unsustainable transition, whatever we want to call it? And how can we go about attacking that thing? It leads you down a new path rather than just saying, here is your threshold. If you do a lot of work below it, if you do a lot of work right at it, if you do some work above it, it's going to get better. But we know that that doesn't seem to hold true for a lot of people. Like they'll do the work to the letter and then not end up improving and not end up racing well. So forget racing. Like they don't even gain fitness in a way
Mm.
that you would understand it previous to racing, right? So yeah, I think knowing when to change something, when to not change anything, and like try to fully cook what you're doing right now, and knowing when to um, look down new avenues and shake things up and start looking for new answers, and when to do which. Like that kind of wisdom is important, and you can't really trust like knowledge or anything. Like I'm really fond of telling people, coaches especially, like the most important decisions you make for an athlete will always be in a situation of uncertainty, because that's why they're important decisions, because you don't know what to do and you have to kind of figure it out, right? And make a guess and place a bet on something. But strategies like having broad definitions that you can narrow in and zoom out, strategies like having that robust testing process to let you learn something about an athlete, and assessment stuff in the gym. Like that's where a ton of my energy goes into, is trying to like, how can I figure out something about this person and limit my assumptions
Mm.
so that when the time comes to make a decision, I can make the best one.
It's informed. I'm excited to shift to talking about the testing, especially in how you use the Moxie. But I want to come back on the closing door idea
Mm-hmm.
that you put forward. It reminds me of and that was probably one of the most influential conversations I've had with Alex Hutchinson, who wrote the book Endure, and
I read it.
who explains his career as a runner, and how he was running. I think I don't know, I forget if he started in the U.S. or in Canada, but he had some good success. And then with school and studies, he moved countries and he started working with a different coach. He was like, "Oh, I found a better program. That's a better way of training. I'm getting better." And then a few years later, he went to the UK and then he started under a different coach and different philosophy. And oh, this is a better training method because now I'm getting better again and I keep improving. And the thing I always say is the best training is the one you've never done. The best stimulus is the one you've never had.
Yeah, that
That
method
goes
was novelty,
yeah, it was just
right?
new, and your body's. You said accommodation. I'm convinced that this is one of the most important concepts to understand, and it works. It's such an interesting concept because it works in a fractal way. It works at many different levels. It works at the level of the exercise. It works at the level of the rep range. It works at the level of the training philosophy too. And you could have a training philosophy that works really well for a year, for 2 years, for five, maybe for 10, but maybe what you need, the next thing that you need is not more of this or better of this, is maybe something different.
Hmm.
And like you said, you're never going to really know when it's time to switch because can I still milk this for a bit? Do I need to change now? But sometimes, like you said, novelty is a stimulus in and of itself, and simply because the body just responds better to it
Yeah.
because it's new.
So, like, let's zoom out to definitions. Like, how do you define accommodation? I'm not sure that I have like a discrete way to describe it, except in relation to a different concept that I can talk about in a second. But you
Mm.
first.
I'd say it's the decreasing response to a given stimulus over time. So as the same
Yeah.
stimulus gets applied over and over and over again, at first your response is important, and then the more you do it, the less you respond to it. An analogy that I use is it's maybe shouting in the street. If it's the early morning and you're walking in the dark and there's no sound, and then you get screamed at and you're like,
Hmm.
and it kind of jolts you. But eventually, if all you hear is screaming all the time around you, you're just going to zone it out and you're not going to respond to that stimulus. And I know you can make parallels with the way matter responds to stimulus as well, and that goes from plants to, I think Aaron Davis even talked about the way metals respond to a given stimulus. I think there's something to accommodation there, and that also applies to us to I guess biological or carbon based beings.
Sure. Okay. Okay, cool. So, getting to accommodation in a moment, like for people that are interested in training, you're touching on something that I think is really, really important and really universal, which is if you stumble on an idea that is conserved across a ton of domains besides your little niche of trying to prepare people for their silly little sports, you are stumbling on something you can really, really trust, right? Like that idea is going to matter and it's really going to hold water and it's going to
Mm.
help you be more productive. Like the coach that I met over the internet that convinced me to come out here to Colorado was from a completely different world. He had spent time at Westside Barbell. He had been in the Marine Corps. He's in strength sports and in field sports. But he talked to me. His name's Cooper Napoli, Delta 5 Performance. He uh, talked about you want to trace all of your training decisions back down to the most fundamental principle that you can find so you can trust it.
Mm.
And the most fundamental thing would be like the physical laws of the universe. So that convinced me, like, oh, I'm not a math guy, but I really need to learn a little bit of like physics, a little bit of basic stuff like leverage and torque and impulse and things like that. Because if you can trace that in terms of like an incoming forces idea for strength training, then you can feel like you're on really solid ground with the decisions you're making and the changes that you're making in somebody's training. So like that idea of a decreasing response to stimulus, I think is really eloquent, especially when you say it's not just about biological people. It's also about, just material science and things like that. And that's like my definition for strength also tries to include that material science definition. Like we talked about, it doesn't have to be a perfect definition, but sometimes it's best to just use what other fields have arrived at. And like in material science, strength would be the ability of a material to accept load without deformation or failure.
Mm-hmm.
And that applies to our, like as just a character, a physical characteristic of our tissues that we are made up of. You have to incorporate that into how you think about strength too, right? So the way I think about accommodation is in relation to adaptation. Like what we're after with training is to drive adaptation, which I would think of as the acquiring of new capacity, right? Either a new level of capacity beyond what you had before, or a completely new thing that the system just didn't have access to before. And so accommodation would be, rather than acquiring a new capacity, you're trading. You're shuffling around your abilities. And my example with people is usually talking about like the physical health of their tissue, and like the idea that your hip, in order to help you get better at running, your hip could just become worse at everything that isn't running. And the bottom line of your running performance, the way you measure it as racing times, will improve. But you got there by making a trade on some level. Maybe you acquired new things along the way, but if we look like system by system, a lot of them might be degrading instead of improving their function to get you to your better performances. And I think that's like you said, you're convinced it's a fundamental thing to understand for training. I think endurance, like it is as well. And I think a lot of people are on the wrong side of that issue. I think that like there's three basic buckets that runners fall into. There's the first bucket where these people are just not training productively. Every time they make it to X miles per week or start adding intensity on the track, something breaks, right? They're not eating enough, they're not sleeping enough, they don't have exposure to hard contractions and impact, and them or their coaches have no idea how to structure a progression of running that actually keeps pace with their ability to adapt to it, right? So their system is broken. It's not working. And I would say that's probably a slight majority of people that call themselves runners. Then a huge amount of runners are in another bucket where their training is productive in the sense that they're PRing, they're getting to start lines for their A races, and they're probably setting PRs, but they're accommodating their way there. Right? There are these trades happening. They're getting worse in certain ways. And it's like the margins by which they're having personal bests are getting smaller and smaller, and it's going to end soon. Not to be like a fear monger, because we don't know what the mechanism is for that, but the reservoir that they are drawing from, the bank account that they are drawing from to get their improvements in their performance is not having any deposits made into it, or it's not having deposits at the same level that it's having withdrawals. And then you have this very rarefied air of people that are training truly productively, in the sense that they are acquiring new capacities. They are turning those capacities into fitness that's specific to their race distance. And then they're learning to express that fitness on race day. And they're actually in a process that works and will continue to work forever, because they have a system for identifying what their limiters are and addressing them. And so that's what we're trying to move people toward, is to be in that camp. I think any coach wants to be having as many athletes as they can, rescuing them from the first two buckets and moving them towards that third one.
Yeah, then I want to come back on that second bucket you mentioned. The way I see it is, and I think we need to talk about the general preparation and the specific preparation in that, where you have a certain capacity for training and a capacity to absorb training in general. And like you said, the trade-off, at least if I understand it in the way you described it, is that you're trading some of the general for the specific, but eventually you don't have enough general to support the specific anymore. So you're turning what should be looking like a pyramid, and it should remain as a pyramid. Obviously, it's going to fluctuate between a very flat pyramid and kind of a more pointy pyramid. But if you just keep pushing that without ever coming back and there's a kind of an oscillation between those two pyramids. You want to flat to more pointy, back to more flat, back to more pointy. But if you just
Mhm.
keep going towards the point, you end up with the Burj Dubai with no foundations, and this is when it falls over, and this is the injury. This is whatever happens that stops your progression. And so I see the kind of the interplay between the general side with the base the foundations that you lay, and then what you put on top of it, and knowing how to bounce between those two over time, a really important idea.
Yeah. So like yeah, what's general? Like if we think really broadly, this is helpful. What let's keep the topic on like endurance sports if that's okay for you,
Sure.
even work capacity sports like that CrossFit would fall underneath, right? Because CrossFit is essentially racing, right?
Mhm.
um yeah, what's general and what's specific? If I think about out loud about it, like there's this aerobic capacity idea, you know what I mean? Like cardiovascular development, pulmonary development, mitochondrial mass and volume, enzyme activity, like those broad buckets, like you want those to drive up.
Mhm.
Then maybe bone density, like neuromuscular ability to contract as many motor units as possible
Mhm.
and at a fast rate. And then like connective tissue density. Like if we do like back of the napkin, like those are the things that you can probably always be trying to drive up forever. And
Mhm.
as long as the work to do those things doesn't take too much time, too much energy, impose too much recovery demand, like that's always running in the background. So you're talking about like really broad, really pointy. I don't think I do that in my own training. I don't think I would argue against it, but I think I'm like more interested in like trying to figure out like a process of exposure where we're kind of doing this, where I'm like trying to put somebody in a current in like this river that's
Mhm.
just heading in this direction and just stay in there. Where you're just always having these exposures, and maybe we like turn little dials up and down, but we're always getting on a small timeline and a broad timeline exposure to these things, and then like tightening and sharpening them when it makes sense.
And what's
Plyos is a great example for that. Like, you know what I mean? Like having somebody on a progression where
mhm.
they're if they're doing just really general dynamic stuff at the beginning and then they do much sharper things because they're ready for it or
Mhm.
based on where they are in their season.
Mhm.
Yeah, I was just thinking out loud. Thanks for allowing me that.
Which is why you're here. Uh, what's interesting is that both, like you said, both work. There's not one recipe. There's not one way to do it, and you can have success with both. And then maybe a, a, I'm just connecting some power to my phone, otherwise it's gonna die.
Okay.
The and maybe that's even. Oh, did I lose my camera for a second? Okay, I'm back. Sorry
Yeah,
about
I
that.
can see you.
Good. And maybe that's even a way to progress, right? A way to change, a way to bring variation is to go from a more kind of almost a vertical integration kind of paradigm where you keep everything and then you modulate slightly to more kind of a block approach where you have
Hmm.
distinct phases in the year and training evolves. But and that's something that we've been doing with Claudia, the French CrossFitter that I've been working with for a few years now. There's a whole group of coaches that we could kind of collaborate on her training and on that project. And what's really interesting is she got to a level a couple of years ago where she actually needed to get away from the sport a little bit more because CrossFit is very taxing as a high intensity sport, especially when you get competitive at a high level. And she just couldn't progress anymore just doing the thing, and we had to go back to, okay, let's allocate some times of the year away from competition to doing things that you need to kind of building your weaknesses and building that foundation, and then we can kind of capitalize on this and move into a more specific phase and then peak and then go to compete. She's actually on the plane to go to Florida right now to go to Wadapalooza. But she hasn't done much CrossFit in September, October, November, right? She started really in December, and so she's been doing 6 weeks of actual CrossFit as it would be defined in terms of metcons and those kind of things. And That's another thing. I see a lot of athletes being afraid of, or maybe not thinking that their week doesn't have to look exactly the same all year round. And like you said, it can vary greatly depending on how you plan the training, but you don't have to just copy paste 52 times across the year, right? You should have some changes in there. And this is also why it's important to have all those considerations, not just do the same rinse repeat ad nauseum.
Yeah, quote unquote, learn and play new sports, right? Was originally
Yes.
part of the ethos before this became a sport and a career. Before that CrossFit became its own thing, it was a way of doing things,
Hmm.
right? Um, like I don't think you see. Maybe it ended with Rich Froning, where you know they're going to play pickup basketball. If you're a committed CrossFitter, you're
Yeah.
preparing for that game season year round, but you also play pickup basketball, play ice hockey, whatever. Like that's the GPP that underlies. If you've turned CrossFit and your preparation for CrossFit, that entire thing you've collapsed it into SPP. Then like, what's the GPP now? Like you got to hike. You got to hike. You got to like do
Yeah.
some stuff. You can't just be in the fluorescent light bulb gym all the time. Like
That,
it's just amazing how people get lost in the sauce that quickly.
and but I think there's been if we talk specifically about CrossFit, that I think people got lost along the way when the divide between the philosophy of CrossFit and this competitive sport happened. And like the Metcon box that is just above nutrition in the CrossFit pyramid, um, they turned that as their sport, so they put it at the
Mm-hmm.
top, and they didn't fill the gap. And they end up with, again, like you said, everything is specific because they think, oh yeah, but CrossFit is a GPP methodology. So if I'm doing CrossFit, I'm doing general stuff. No, because now you're only doing 3 to 15 minute. And yeah, but it's constantly varied. Yeah, but you know what?
Yeah,
I can count. I can tell you exactly what movements might come up and that you have to be ready for. So in the end, you're rarely pulling in the horizontal plane. You're rarely doing anything that's above 20 minutes. There's still
yeah.
many things that are actually missing from the competitive sport itself. And I think this is where we can plug the holes and actually bring a bit more of that general aspect so that when you go to actually perform at the highest level in your discipline, you have the stuff to back it up, or at least you're not going to break in the process. Like you said, it's you don't want it to just be, oh, okay, I'll be able to just push, but then I have to retire because all I did through my teens was CrossFit. And unfortunately, we saw quite a few female athletes in the last couple of years that
Yeah.
have bowed out of the sport because all they did from, I don't know, 12 to 18 was just CrossFit day in and day out, and it's just too much. And I know I'm caricaturing, and there's a lot to those backstories, but
But
it's
that's a universal. Like
it
that's
is,
a
yeah.
in the United States, there's like the disappearance of the three sport athlete. You know what I mean? Where the kid that
Yep.
played football in the fall, basketball in the winter, and baseball in the spring is virtually gone. But
And
those kids have healthy careers and get scholarships like anybody else. And I would argue that's the way to go. Like, but just I think it's hilarious. Like with CrossFit, like you assume that the sport is adaptability, but then they throw a single under your way in competition, and you have people that literally can't do it. You know what I
mm,
mean? Just
mm.
because they've so refined I guess it's the double under and things like that. It's yeah, it's like that inability to zoom out and understand what the point might be. But anytime there's money on the line, you gotta you gotta try to refine what you can there. And I guess that's what we're talking about with the kids too. Is we're talking about scholarships. We're talking about parents that think they might be able to give their kid a leg up and that ability to get competitive earlier, but they are again like I'm talking about, they're sacrificing that true reservoir of what is going to help them, the general adaptability that's going to help them be as good at their sport as they could, and trading it for specificity.
And maybe too often even imposing expectations that they couldn't meet when they were younger or that they would hope to see in their children at this point in time, right? Just
Mm-hmm.
I think
Yeah.
that's endemic, and it's important to talk about it because we cannot, as parents, expect our children to be the champions today because we want kids to are as champions, right? It's cool. It almost it's an ego thing. Again, we come back to, oh, why are you screaming at the ref on the side of the pitch? Your kid is 5 years old. Just let him play the game. How about we just have a good time? And I think that is it's an important topic, and it's not taught in school. It's not taught at parent-kid meetings, and but it should be.
Yeah, I feel really lucky that I spent time away from endurance. I was always doing running and riding my bike and training for that. But as far as like the gym environment that I started being a coach in wasn't the endurance world. I think that gave me a lot of that context that makes me useful for endurance athletes now. But it also cemented in my head, like, oh, I kind of need to work with a little bit of everybody all the time. And I mean that in terms of like populations, ages, and then also like goal sets, like what they're interested in and what they're training for. Like I think I always need to be working for a few gen pop people that just want to get a little bit fitter, because you learn a ton from that and you don't like end up closing off your skill set and being really blind to a lot of uh to a lot of things. And I lost my train of thought again. I'm sorry.
I got something if I can pick
But
up from here. It just reminds me, back to that flat to pointy pyramid.
mhm.
It's the same with our skills as coaches. If you can be exposed to different demographics, I think that does raise our skill level as coaches and our global understanding. Just like we were talking about before, one of the best advices anybody ever gave me as a coach is back to Pat Davidson, who's been extremely influential in my years since I started, is just read outside of coaching. Go pick up a physics book, go pick up a sociology book, a psychology book. And those are all tangentially related to what you do, but actually going out and then bring in whatever nuggets you find back into what you do. And just like you said, you learn stuff from your Gen Pop clients, you'll be able to reapply this contextually with your endurance athletes, and that will make you a better coach. But we're back to the idea of silos. We're in so many different silos on so many levels, and we're afraid of going out of this because we think that we're going to lose something. But there's actually everything to be gained outside of this little narrow band that you think you have to stay in on every different level.
Yeah, there's something to be said about like obsession. There's something to be said about really narrowing in on a specific problem or being that person that went so deep on a subject that you discover something new to share with everybody else. But yeah, I think that matching with those stories, it's equally, there's probably as many stories as somebody that just had a general epiphany about the way the world works and the way a biological structure is organized and then brought that to microchips or something like that. You know what I mean? Somebody that zoomed out enough to go to their problem. It's a different way of going about it. And I think there are what I was going to say, I found it. There's certainly a select number of coaches that only work with that specific population for a specific problem, or they only work with elite athletes. You know what I mean? They've kind of siloed themselves in that way, but like I think they miss out on that, ability to extrapolate sometimes. Like, and I've gotten on the edge of that. I've gotten to a point here in Boulder where I was working for enough pros, which is a weird nebulous term because I've learned that even somebody being a professional athlete doesn't mean that they can really pay you. You know what I mean? Like sometimes they're struggling to make a living too. It just means
Right.
that they are trying to make the living doing only the sport,
Mm,
But
mm.
I got to the point where like I worked with enough people that were really committed that maybe I could say that's all I do, but I'm really glad that I feel like I had the context to not do that and just always, I know who I want to work for in a broad sense, but I don't categorize it in that way in terms of like a competitive level. And I'm really glad I don't.
I think that's a good general advice to coaches is get out of your sport, get out of what you've always done, get out of the demographic. You'll learn something valuable, and you'll definitely be able to bring it back. I do want to talk about going from the macro a bit more to the micro, and talk about the Moxy assessments that you do, And maybe for the part of the audience that doesn't know what Moxy is, can you first of all explain what the tool is, and then how you apply it, how you use it in your coaching?
Yeah, so the way I understand the Moxy monitor and other NIRS devices is that they're able to measure the oxygen saturation in a working muscle in live time, which is the definition from somebody that you've had be a podcast guest 5 years ago, and I picked it up from them. And the idea there is you are inferring the supply demand relationship of oxygen, the most important rate limiting substrate in exercise. You are inferring the supply demand relationship of that in your muscles that are metabolizing it as it's happening, because that is the thing, the fundamental scenario that determines sustainable work versus unsustainable work, right? So um, any other thing that you might be measuring in your training, whether it's perceived exertion or your power zones, your pace zones, your heart rate zones, those are all proxies for what we believe that scenario is at that time, right? So situations of over delivery where you are sending more oxygen, more oxygen rich blood to the muscle, situations of under delivery where the muscle is consuming more oxygen at a faster rate than you can deliver it, or situations of steady state. Those are the scenarios that create our training, right? We're always going to be either very broadly in one of those buckets or very specifically if you're trying to be at zone 1.9 or whatever, right? Depending on how you view intensity control. So the reason I think Moxy is so powerful is because it allows you to visualize that scenario pretty acutely rather than relying on those proxies, because those proxies are not great, right? Heart rate zones are better than nothing, sometimes better than perceived exertion, depending on the athlete you're actually talking to and their sense of themselves, um, which is another really interesting topic. But the Moxy helps you learn about an athlete in the sense of the actual variable that really matters rather than relying on those proxies like lactate. That the term that I've discovered that I really love is that things that are quote unquote metabolically distant from the phenomenon that actually determines training stress.
Hmm.
So that's my answer.
It's an interesting way to see it. I agree with you. I think the auction is at the center of everything, and as I understand energetics today, except for the first few seconds of effort, because you have a let's say a buffer of phosphocreatine that's in the resting muscle cell that you can just use
Mm-hmm.
up for free, quote unquote.
Right.
Phosphocreatine resynthesis is tightly linked to oxygen. It comes from mitochondrial ATP, right? Mitochondrial ATP puts the phosphocreatine back together and then shuttles it out to the myofibrils. And so there is no, past the first 10 seconds, there's no phosphocreatine without oxygen.
And
You
that bucket for the first 10 seconds is only there because you filled it with oxygen,
exactly,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You had
100%.
before time zero, some work got done to
Exactly.
actually
100%.
fill that bucket.
And then you take glycolysis and the end product gets used inside the mitochondria, so back to the oxygen, or if there's not enough, then it gets pushed out to the blood and then it gets either to other organs or to other muscles that are going to use it there. But in the end, everything revolves around oxygen, and that was one way in which Evan was instrumental in the evolution of my perspective of human energetics. It's bringing those different systems back together and stop looking at equations on a piece of paper and saying, well, there's no oxygen and there's no lactate, so it's an anaerobic alactic system. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Chemically, it is. Uh, if you isolate it from the context within which it exists. And so I think taking the perspective of oxygen is a really helpful one to understand how the body works, and it also allows us to maybe zoom out a bit from that minutia that is fascinating, and I love talking about that stuff. But at the end of the day, that's not exactly what's gonna make your athlete go faster on race
Yeah.
day per se.
The way that I describe it to people is that maybe like a single fiber or a bundle of muscle fibers or a region of fibers might be supplied with energy, quote unquote, anaerobically. But there's no such thing as a whole body anaerobic performance condition. And we train at the level of the whole body, right? Especially if we're trying to do like, you know, improve metabolism for endurance, right? Maybe you could do isolated leg extensions to failure for quads, but like generally if we want to stress the heart, we need whole body energy expenditure, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's best to just zoom out that way. And if we're looking at the whole body level or the regional level, then oxygen is the thing. So Moxy lets you visualize that, and then importantly, by bringing gas exchange to it, which is new for me. I've been doing Moxy assessments, not a ton of them, maybe like 10 a year at the most. Um, I just got a VO2 master, so I just have exposure to gas exchange. I've been using poor man's measurements for that of like a pulse oximeter matched with asking athletes to count their breaths
Mm-hmm.
during the final step of each step of a 4-1 test, the final minute of it. I mean, so been able to infer some things about the pulmonary system, but I've never had tidal volume. I've never had ventilation or anything like that. But ultimately, what we're looking for, at least the way I see it and the way I think you see it as well, is we're looking at the relationship of these systems: oxygen uptake, oxygen delivery, oxygen utilization, and are they developed in a matched way to each other, or is one really lagging behind and thus representing the rate limiting step in oxygen consumption,
Mm-hmm.
which would be really powerful to know if you're a coach whose job is to remove those barriers to improve performance and productive training.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's I fully agree with that. Can you go into keep it broad strokes, but go a little bit more into detail on how you use the information that you gather from a Moxy assessment? What do you do with the data? How do you look at it?
Yeah. So the first thing to understand is that I'm, for the most part, just a strength coach. Like the testing is a hobby because I think it's super interesting, and in Boulder I want to build myself as a problem solver for endurance athletes, and most of the problems that people have here
Mm-hmm.
are on the strength side, right? They have a run coach or whatever. So very few people am I their sports specific coach in designing their run training,
Mm-hmm.
but when people have problems to solve or some weird thing that we want to investigate, being able to do that testing can help us say at a broad level, like where has your training gotten you from a development perspective, not a performance perspective? And did anything get left behind along the way? And then how can we go about that? And I would say here at altitude, I don't know whether it's specific to altitude or just in general with people that are pretty fast, like sub elites, but like gaining insight into that respiratory limitation of like, okay, like you're not having any interruptions to blood volume during your running, but you are having this major supply deficit, right? Where we see SMO2 get really low,
Mm-hmm.
like being able to identify that breathing might not be adequate and connect people with ways to work on uh, quote unquote better breathing, um, isolated from their run training, is really profound. I've seen it help people with like weird airway narrowing stuff, post viral recovery,
Mm-hmm.
and then also just um, being a bridge to better breathing in their workouts, whether it's respiratory warm ups or um, cueing the breathing that they want in intervals, or tripling the amount of time they spend at huge tidal volumes in their week instead of just on their intense days. Like all those things are really helpful bridges to get them to stressing the pulmonary system even more. So Moxy and the measurements with VO2 Master are going to help me identify that in people even more readily, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's probably one of the most interesting aspects of training for me currently, and it has been for a few years now, the respiratory training side of things. And not it's not new. There's, Jörg Feldman and those guys and the whole Moxie crew from the very beginning that have been using it for maybe 20, 30 years. And
Mm.
and we can trace back other practices to that even further back. But I guess it's becoming democratized. It's not mainstream yet, but it's still such a new field, and learning how to investigate it, like you said, having the VO2 master, seeing how somebody's frequency of breathing evolves through the intensity spectrum, looking at the tidal volume relative to their spirometry. So what percentage of their, FEV1 or their expiratory power over 1 second, if you want to call it that, can they hold on a dynamic exercise? I just started using the Power Breathe K5 as an assessment tool to look at inspiratory strength, and looking at the curve of that, and then looking at different factors related to that. I have a colleague in France, Cyril Ricci, his name is Ricci, who is a performance scientist, as he calls himself. He monitors and tests Tour de France level cyclists and professional triathletes. And he's kind of taken the respiratory thing a couple years back and just run with it, and did his own kind of N of ones and micro studies with his athletes. And he's starting to, talk about how the inspiratory becomes limiting above second threshold, for example. So before that, it's probably the expiratory, but then beyond, it shifts because of the rate of breathing and how much time you actually have to contract your diaphragm and bring the air in. And then you can start thinking about, like you said, thinking about respiratory frequency. You can even have zones of respiratory frequency or ideal frequencies based on intensities that they find themselves at relative to their tidal volumes. Can we maintain them for longer, as you said before? It's such an interesting field. And what's also fascinating, there's so many branches that tie back to it. Can you talk about how you see breathing today in training as a broad idea?
Yeah, I mean, like the as you know, the assumption in sports science for a long time was that the respiratory system was overbuilt for the demands of exercise. And, for very few people that were probably messing with it on their own, it was just assumed that that's not a limiting factor. As long as you don't have any sort of pathology, it just works. And now we can identify a lot of different ways, and that's in which case that's not true. But then also, it's sort of a badge of honor to have a respiratory limitation absent of any physiology. Like you have to have a pretty well developed heart and vasculature and local muscle infrastructure for that to be the thing that limits your performance. For a lot of people, it's a lower hanging fruit. If you're new to endurance, it's going to be your heart, right? Almost definitely. And if you only do long, slow efforts and never do any intensity, it's going to be a utilization thing. Like these things are pretty simple. But once you have been doing it for a long time, then yeah, breathing can start to be a major limiting factor and something that you should look to improve. But just broadly zooming out to it, it's like a third of the process. You have to uptake oxygen and get it into your blood. You have to deliver it, and you have to utilize it in the muscle. So it's like, how could it not be important to put a magnifying glass on if you're interested in performing at your best?
Yeah, I relate to what you said. The quote that I see it's still today in textbooks, and I think this quote is correct when it says that the pulmonary system is typically not a limiting factor to endurance performance, and what endurance performance is defined in this context is VO2 max. So if you narrowly define endurance performance as VO2 max, we know the pulmonary system is, again, typically not. If you're at altitude, it can be. If you have arterial hypoxemia because you're pushing 40 liters of blood around your body because you're an absolute monster, and those red blood cells that have to go one by one through the microvasculature around the lungs just don't have enough time to literally pick up oxygen, and that limits your oxygen consumption. But absent from that, the pulmonary system itself is not an issue. A stat that really stands out for me, I guess there's two things that I think are important to understand and to kind of see how important the respiratory system is and how it can be trained, is the respiratory metabolic reflex, which is a well-studied concept. Essentially, your brain prioritizes your diaphragm and your breathing muscles even above your legs. And so if your diaphragm fatigues, it's going to shunt blood from your legs to your diaphragm. That's very basic respiratory physiology. And That's actually how it works, and they've done amazing studies to show that. And another one is that, especially for a highly trained endurance athlete, your respiratory system can consume, when you're doing a high intensity effort type VO2 max, your respiratory muscles can consume up to 20% of your VO2. So you
Hmm.
20% of your oxygen consumptions is centralized on your respiratory muscles. And what's cool about muscles, we've been talking about it from the beginning, is you can train them. And the diaphragm can be trained and the respiratory system can be trained, and you can make them stronger, you can make them more endurant, you can better coordinate your frequency and your depth of breathing, you can tolerate CO2 better. There's so many things that you can do that will have a significant impact on your performance. And even I would even argue that if it didn't improve performance per se, I would still argue for it because of the perceptive aspect of breathing, and how if you're if you feel like if you're breathing hard, you're first of all, your brain's going to perceive that it's a hard effort, and typically if your breathing is more labored, will impact how you perceive your effort. And if you're able to control it, as Brian Kozak famously said, it's either you control your breathing or it controls you. And it switches from one to the other really quickly. And once you're not in control of your breathing anymore, it's the beginning of the end. And it's going to be really hard to finish that interval, finish that race at the same pace, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, a lot of things popped into my head from what you were saying, and I lost most of them. But the big thing that sticks is like, yeah, this idea that yeah, it's adaptable. Of course it's adaptable. And I think even more broadly, like it starts a large conversation about the role of science in our understanding. Like I think that physical preparation and nutrition are two of the hardest domains to study with the scientific method, just because of the need to isolate those variables to get to any type of conclusion. Takes the real world applicability out of it. And I don't think I'm saying anything too crazy by suggesting that.
Hmm.
It means you have to have a little bit different filter for information, and you can't be super that it puts evidence based in context,
Hmm.
right? And I think that there's a principle that saves me from participating in any of these discussions of like, is this trainable? Like, can we even influence this? I think I've got a razor that cuts right through that, which is if it changes over time, it's trainable, right? If this variable that you're measuring or the function and structure of this system changes across time, then training it is just a matter of communicating with the mechanisms by which it changes, right? Whether it's to resist the negative change that you don't want, influence positive change, whatever it is. Like, so the respiratory system, there's no way that it's immune from that. We just have to learn what is the language that this system speaks and how can we speak that language with effort to get there. And like things like separating breathing from, or like apnea stuff, or separating breathing from your activity using an isocapnic rebreather are super powerful to start like getting someone to feel at a conscious level and getting the respiratory system to quote unquote feel some new inputs that'll influence that change in a structural or functional way that we desire.
And I think even absent of tools and outside interventions per se, just the idea of thinking about how you're
Pay
breathing,
attention. Yeah.
paying attention is such a powerful thing that anybody can do without buying any equipment or programs or whatever. Is just pay attention to how your breathing is going and how it changes over time, and how it's influenced by internal and external factors. And to the extent that you can control it and manipulate it, you can gain a better understanding. And even just that will have a positive impact on the quality of your training, on the control that you have, and ultimately, I think your performance.
Yeah. There are a lot of coaches out there that are very dismissive of like, I don't know, things like well, respiratory training in general, but then even like the idea of nose breathing and trying to, if that there might be any reason why you might restrict that stuff. And it's like, why would you close yourself off from something like that? You can decide it's not a tool you want to engage with and use, but to say that it's silly, because it's just like I said, if something changes over time, it's trainable. The idea if something's different, it's different. Like the idea that there's no difference between nose breathing and mouth breathing, and just do whatever you want. These are two different things. If they're different, they must be different in ways that we can understand immediately, and ways that we probably need to really investigate to figure out. And like, you're either interested in figuring out those differences, or you're not, right? And then I want to have as many paths to go down and as many tools in the toolbox, so to speak, to apply to a given situation as my brain can handle.
Hmm. Hmm.
And thank goodness for being able to write stuff down.
Yes, it is a superpower when you use it right. And I think that that speaks to maybe some coaches needing to always have an opinion about everything. I mean, I know there's many things I don't understand,
Yeah, and have a
and
right opinion.
yeah, but yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, or even an informed one. Because I know, for example, I'll take back to the bioenergetics Evans model, which I took a lot from a few years ago. I know I saw him talk about this probably 2 years prior to me actually diving into that world. And I literally saw it from the corner of my eye and I said, I'm not ready to forget
Mm,
everything that I've learned so far and relearn everything. And I left it there because I just wasn't ready. It's not that I didn't like it or I thought it was wrong or that I preferred the other way. It's just I know I needed to allocate a substantial amount of time to updating my thinking on this. And that moment just wasn't the time. And so I just circled back to it when the moment came, and accepted that okay, I might have lost 2 years, quote unquote, but no, I learned a ton of stuff in the meantime, and now it's just time to update this side of things. But yeah, just I don't think we need to have such strong opinions about things we don't really understand.
sure. Yeah, it's really hard to find information that will hit you the right way at the right time and speak the language you speak right now,
Mm,
but help usher you towards some different understanding. And I think you're like some of the episodes I've listened to on your podcast with people that are talking about similar topics to what we are right now, with Evan and Luke Way and Andrew Sellers, and these people that are talking about that stuff have been really helpful for me over the past 5 years or so, where it's been exactly that. It's like they speak my language, but they also point me in this direction and fill in a gap. So that's really good. And I think like you probably don't, I'm sure you don't promote it anymore, but for the listener, like you have a great YouTube video about that, like the new paradigm of bioenergetics or something like that. I
yeah,
watched that and took notes on it 3 times to try to help me get it through my
thanks, man.
head of like what this might be. Because reading that glycogen shunt paper was way too much. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like this is, I don't speak this language yet, but he's got charts. Sean has charts, and that's going to help me get there.
yeah.
And then I made my own chart for it to really cement it in my own head. So it's like there's a lot of people talking about, yeah, I don't know. That's a whole broad conversation about how we communicate things. And yeah, people want to just be right. People want to have the right opinion and just have like it's really comforting to just be like, oh, I can put that on the shelf. I know how I feel about that. But
Mm-hmm.
like, yeah, being a little more open. It's easy for me to say, but like I think I'm speaking from the heart that like having some openness about like exploring concepts and being really curious is like it's not a cliche thing that's really helpful. It's a fundamental thing if you want to be someone that's going to get better at your job year over year, whatever job we're talking about.
Hmm. I think uncertainty is unsettling, and
Certain, yeah, definitely.
to relearn things, you need to be okay with letting go of stuff. And I think if you can try to not associate yourself and personality with the ideas that you hold at that point in time, that's a helpful concept that I was made sensitive to early on, and that has really helped me to not I just identify with the information that I hold as true at that point in time, and just be able to say, oh, you know what? No, I was wrong there, or oh no, I'm gonna let that go because that's got updated. It's kind of Bayesian inference kind of thinking where you're just going to take things in, and as it comes in, you're going to update what you already have. And sometimes you get paradigm shifts where you have to flip the table and start over with a blank piece of paper, which are, I'd say, pretty rare events, but they come around once in a while. I think that those are fun because you always think that you're right about everything that you know when you think it. And you of course you're going to learn new stuff. Of course you're going to discover new things. Of course you're going to sometimes have a paradigm shift and have to massively change everything that you had organized because there's this big thing that's coming in now and you know it has to be there. You just don't know quite how it's going to fit. But yeah, we don't know what we don't know, and we need to be more open to that if we want to learn better.
Yeah, like of course you can't escape ego and looking for comfort about like having arrived at a good place where you're going to be useful. But I think like what's helpful for me is, yeah, like going back to this idea of definitions, you're going to place a bet on this way of thinking about this thing. But it's not, maybe it shouldn't be about how right and correct it is, but it's just its utility. It's just like thinking about this in this way right now helps me use that understanding as a key in a lock.
Hmm.
It serves me for now, and I can develop it, I can iterate it, I can discard it, like the whole Jeet Kune Do thing, right?
Hmm.
Like I guess for the listener, it's like, what did he say? To discard that which is not useful, keep that which is useful, and add what is essentially your own. I hope that's
Hmm.
about right, right?
Sounds
Like, yeah,
good.
it's gotta kind of look that way. And I'm a big I value self-determination. Like I work for myself on purpose. I know I'll eventually get connected with people that think the way I do and think differently than I do in exactly the right way, and really tie together what we do. Not in a hurry for that, but in the meantime, like I'm a big proponent for coaches to have strong opinions of their own and like have their own identity as the way they do things and not take somebody else's labels for how they do stuff. And I think there's this whole generation of people that want to help people in the gym, but need to attach themselves as an FRC coach or their whatever knees over toes guy's umbrella where he indoctrinates these college kids thing. Like they to attach themselves to something, whether it's for a marketing purpose or an in-group thing. But it's like, yeah, I want to succeed or fail as a coach based on like how I trust my filter for information. I trust my decision making process and my ability to like connect with the athletes that I work for and convince them to trust me, not in a manipulative way. I think you know what I mean. Like,
Hmm.
yeah, convince them that I'm on their team. And I think anybody that tries to do the work that you and I do, I think that would serve them a lot better than planting a bunch of flags about the way that they think about things. So like I've really enjoyed this conversation because it's exactly the type of zoom in, zoom out thing I like to do, and gets me hearing the way somebody else would word something is super beneficial for me, because a lot of this some of the stuff we're talking about is um not discussed very widely, like getting in touch with people that also do the physiological testing and just having somebody to bounce ideas off is enormous. Anything that can take you from just your own brain to something outside of it is really good. So this has been cool. Not to like cut us off or anything.
No, it's you took the words right out of my mouth, man. I was gonna say thank you so much for this great conversation. I've really enjoyed the last couple hours that we just spent together, and I've learned a whole bunch of things. I think you brought some really interesting, simple, all-encompassing definitions to the table that, again, I think are very, very useful, and I'm gonna use them or some of them moving forward. And I hope other people's took out from this conversation as much as I did. Um, for those that would like to know more, get in touch with you, work with you, where can they find you online, Keith?
Yeah, highergroundathletics.com. And I'm on Instagram at highergroundathletics with underscores between those words. And I like having these big zoomed out conversations. Yeah, I like connecting with anybody that might be able to get something unstuck in my brain or ask me to describe something to them that I can gain from trying to word it a little bit different. I think as a coach, like working with people, like it's kind of cool how you've got your way that you teach something, but then all of a sudden you run into somebody that doesn't get it from the way that you're used to describing it or the way you're
Mm.
used to taking something through it. And then all of a sudden you have to find a new way. And then you have new ways to talk something through. So I would like to accelerate that process socially as quick as I can. So yeah, find me on there. And I love talking about training, and I'm not obsessed with turning people into customers or anything like that. It's yeah, just like being a coach.
The links are in the description. Keith, thanks again, and I'll see you on the next episode.
Hey, thanks, Sean.
Before I let you go, I want to tell you a little bit more about this podcast sponsor. All You Need Nutrition is a high-quality supplement brand proudly made in France. When they first reached out to me, my wife, who's a trained nutritionist, had a lot of questions about the different ingredients that they use. So we scheduled a call with Miriam, the mastermind behind the entire All You Need product line. After the call that lasted almost 2 hours, my wife was really impressed by their transparency and the quality of their products. She was excited to work with a brand like All You Need. And if my wife says yes to a supplement brand, I'm on board without hesitation. Personally, I love their whey protein. I use it after every strength session or mix it in with my yogurt in the morning when I want a little extra protein. It's not too sweet, the cocoa flavor is delicious, and it blends really well. Their one product is fantastic if you're looking for a light energy boost plus all the vitamins and minerals you might need if you're used to training hard. My wife sticks to 1 scoop, but I go for 2. Make sure you find the dose that works for you. And special shout out to their shaker bottle. It's literally the best shaker I've used in the past 15 years. We've been using their supplements for the last 2 months, and we're genuinely thrilled to be working with them. If you want to support the podcast, click the link in the description to check out their whole product line and use the code UPSIDE for 10% off on your next order with All You Need Nutrition. Take care and see you in the next episode.